When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 482, Stalin's Dreams Almost Come True. Last time, on December 5th, 1941, Stalin launched his counterattack around Moscow, which just happened to dovetail nicely with Operation Typhoon grinding to a halt. And it's not like the Panzer armies wanted to stop, but as they were low on everything from spare parts to winter clothing, they had little choice. So went over to a defensive stance. The question now was, were they as good at defense as they were offense? And at first, with the limited success of the Soviet 29th Army on December 5th pushing back against the German 9th Army some 6 miles to the north of Moscow, the answer seemed to be yes. On the other hand, that limited success, after so many defeats, was enough for Stalin, who would order Zhukov to activate the other forces to the north and south of Moscow. And Marshal Zhukov would order the other armies to engage, but he also tried to temper Stalin's expectations. Why? Because the Russians weren't ready for an all-out offensive. An example for this was given on the second day of the offensive, December 6th. Yes, the Soviet 29th Army had done well its first day, but then became stalled. The Germans had been caught off guard, but rallied quickly, making the Soviets pay dearly for their advance. Proving Zhukov's point, though, the Soviet 31st Army joined the frustrated 29th Army, but little new territory was gained. Still, the enemy had been engaged, which Stalin wanted, and the men of those two Soviet armies saw more enemy corpses than ever before. Of course, to rack up such enemy casualties, the Soviets had to sacrifice many more of their own. But Stalin was willing to pay that price. But again, as Zhukov kept reminding his master, the Germans were being pushed back, not destroyed, and they would not be destroyed anytime soon. Yet, the larger picture must be remembered. The German 9th Army was more or less holding for the moment on that December 6th, but this allowed the Soviet 30th Army, attacking just to the northeast of Klin and northeast of the Soviet counterattack, to advance some 12 kilometers against Panzer Group 3. And von Bock, Army Group Center's commander, could do little about it. His hands were also tied, what with his lack of supplies and exhausted men. And those supplies continued to dwindle. The Soviet 30th Army reported the capture of 186 guns, 1,200 automatic rifles, and just over 1,000 vehicles, all kinds. Again, Zhukov could see Stalin getting excited, but gently reminded the man on top that surely most, if not all, of these pieces of equipment had already been damaged. This was not a new loss for the enemy. Stalin did not appreciate having his bubble burst. All Zhukov got in return was an acknowledging grunt, which is when the 1st Shock and 20th Armies moved out against elements of the Panzer Groups 3 and 4 just west and northwest of Moscow, but closer to the city and just south of the 1st Soviet counterattack. And the Soviets gained a little territory here, mostly closer to Krasnaya Poliana, due west of Moscow, versus Yakhroma, to the capital's northwest. Point is, the enemy, at the very least, would be getting no closer to Moscow. And secondly, not only were the green Soviet troops gaining experience, Soviet Russia as a whole was learning. What were they learning? That the Wehrmacht were not superhuman. They could be beat. For now, the threat to the north of Moscow was not so much negated as neutralized.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Meanwhile, to the south of Moscow, Stalin's counterstroke there also yielded results, however costly. Practically 50 kilometers, or 31 miles due east of Tula, was Guderian's greatest penetration. Thus, the Soviet 10th Army, 1 rifle division and 2 motorized infantry regiments strong, hit there, pushing west. In conjunction with this, the 2nd and 13th Armies attacked near Yelets, about 110 miles or 177 kilometers south by southeast of the first part of the attack. The idea was if the top and bottom halves of the Tula Bulge could be backed up, then the center part would have no choice but to retreat as well, to keep the line straight. To stay in place would almost certainly equate being cut off and surrounded. A bit of poetic justice. And demonstrating how close to breaking the higher-ups in Moscow had been before this moment, when these limited counterattacks showed promise, there were no screams of patriotic fervor, no declaring the superiority of communism over fascism. Well, maybe there was in the Soviet newspapers, but not in the Kremlin. There, it was expressed as relief and accepting reality. Members of Zhukov's staff would write that things started well because the Germans were tired, unprepared for the conditions, unprepared for this sudden attack, and the Russians had planned methodically. Still, the Russians, suffered massive casualties, which now was simply the price of doing business. Unfortunately, Russian civilians were also caught unawares, as they were killed right alongside the combatants. Russian soldiers would later recount that old women and children's bodies were all over the place, mixed with the dead Russians and Germans. Again, the price of doing business. And as success is built upon success, it is the same with defeat. One German medic recorded this after barely escaping this Russian assault. As I was making something to eat, all hell broke loose outside. Everything was pulling back. Panzers, artillery guns, vehicles, and soldiers, singularly or in groups. They were all in shock. There were no orders. Everyone took up the retreat and looked no further forward than what he felt he might reach. Most vehicles didn't start because of the terrible cold. Despite that, we were able to take most of the medical supplies with us. We tried to keep together with the remnants of the company so far as possible, but whomever fell out was lost. And proving once again that membership has its privileges, the motorized units and panzer crews were able to retreat faster than the footed infantry. The latter had shown up last while walking on foot, yet were important to the entire enterprise. They rarely received the praise that the panzer crews got, and now they were being left behind as the Russians closed in and the transports fled. Forced to turn and fight, the number of German infantry, dead or captured, started to mount. The strategic and operational surprise achieved by Moscow was equally due to German arrogance. Clearly, the Russians, had no reserves left, went the thinking, but also the added ingredient of access exhaustion and limited means, mostly due to weather, of continuing to gather intelligence must be included. Either way, all that had been gained by the Germans in November had now been lost in a matter of days, along with too many Axis troops and equipment, and the Soviet counterattack continued. To understand what's about to happen next, a mental map is needed. About 50 kilometers or 31 miles northwest of Moscow is the city of Klin, and another 50 kilometers to the northwest of Klin is Kalinin, itself barely inside German-controlled territory. And around Klin, the 3rd Panzer Group was operating, and below it, closer to being due west of Moscow, was the 4th Panzer Group, so 3rd Panzer Group on top, 4th Panzer Group on bottom. Behind the two panzer groups is the 9th Army, and operating to the south of it is the 4th Army. Now we jump back to the fighting. The Soviet 30th Army, operating due north of Klin by some 20 kilometers or 12 miles, was pushing west, and soon was close to the Moscow-Leningrad highway. If this road was secured by the Soviets, then there would be a break, a gap in between Panzer Group 3 and von Kluge's 4th Army, operating just southwest of Moscow. This left Panzer Group 3 rather exposed, as it could not call in help from the 4th Army. And it only got worse when, on December 13th, when Klin itself was reached by elements of the 1st Shock Army. Point is, the tip of Panzer Group 3 was about to be encircled by the 30th Army and the 1st Shock Army. In reaction, on that same day, December 13th, von Bock quietly ordered preparations for the evacuation of Kalinin, which is to the northwest of Klin. He would save what forces he could. Hopefully, it would not cost him his head with Berlin. For the Germans, this was intolerable, so it offered heavy resistance at Klin. But now, the Soviets had the bit between their teeth. They took up this challenge and fought for Klin for 2 straight days. Both sides were bled, but in the end, on December 15th, the Germans had to back up and relinquish the town. Proving that von Bock was surprised by the quantity, if not the quality, of the enemy troops coming at his forces, his diary from December 12th to the 15th has phrases like, "It's only cavalry," in regards to a breakthrough in the north, and that Guderian's defensive actions were going according to plan. The most negative phrase was, in regards to the south, that one enemy attack was a source of worry. But what von Bock did not know of Zhukov's plans could fill volumes. Next, this taking of Klin made possible an attack on German-held Istra, 25 kilometers or 15 miles due north of Moscow, so southeast of Klin by that same distance. As this was closer to Moscow than Klin, it brought joy to Stalin's headquarters. Clearly, for the moment, the momentum was with the Russians. As Istra was the city that the German panzers had used to come through to get to Moscow's outer area, this brought relief. But building on this, the Soviets kept pushing on December 12th, capturing the city of Smolensk, halfway between Moscow and Klin. Truly, the immediate threat to the capital was disappearing as the early days of December went by, though it cost the Russians thousands of lives. Meanwhile, in the south, things weren't any better for the invaders. Also connected to the German 4th Army, operating west and southwest of Moscow, was Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army. And 2nd Panzer's main supply line ran through Orel, about 90 miles or 144 kilometers southwest of Tula. Thus, the panzers were in between the capital and their supply line, basic safeguards of resources. But the Soviet offensive saw their 50th Army just north of Tula and their 10th Army due east of Tula threaten this very supply line. While the 50th Army, again just north of Tula, cut the connection between the 2nd Panzer and the 4th Army, the 10th Army swung just south of Tula, pressing westward, thus exposing that supply line. Suddenly, Guderian's position was untenable. Through all this, it took the Russian High Command and its foot soldiers a few days to realize they were winning. So conditioned had they become to think of the invaders as invincible. But soon came a divergence between the command structure and the foot soldier, a desire, a need to do more, faster. As the Russian infantry moved west, they found town after town set aflame by the retreating Germans, and this they did as they carried out orders from their officers. So, without asking for permission or sharing their experiences, the men of the various Soviet armies started walking faster or fighting harder, if only to get to the next town before it was set aflame. thus leaving ordinary Russians out in the cold. Ironically, a few soldiers just happened to be operating near their own hometowns, the place of their birth, and now they came upon them, destroyed. They did not want that to happen anywhere else, so started fighting angry, not desperate. Not that there had been much mercy between the two forces, but sadistic measures would soon be taken by both sides for the rest of the war. What will happen next will show that not even a staff officer, the son of an officer, is beyond self-deception or unwilling to see the truth that is before them. Back on December 7th, Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Group, described his situation to von Bock in the blackest of terms. The panzer leader told his commanding officer of the crisis of confidence of his troops and their non-commissioned officers, the backbone of the armed forces. Von Bock tried to be confident, tried to lift Guderian's spirits, but it was not to be. Then Guderian took it to the next level by asking his superior, clearly skirting on the edge of insubordination, has the OKH, or the Army High Command, been updated on recent events? In other words, had von Bock been truthful about this painful and embarrassing turn of events? Von Bock was more shocked than angry, and in that mood, he contacted General Franz Halder, Chief of Staff of the OKH, and brought him up to date on the situation and what Guderian had conveyed to him. Halder replied, "Guderian, he's giving in to his fatigue." To wit, von Bock honestly told his superior, "I am unable to counter any determined attack against my forces." Halder thought about this for a moment and then coolly replied, "Oh, the Russians were obviously using cadets and untrained troops. The pressure that von Bock was experiencing was due to numbers, not quality. But by the end of the month, they would be exhausted or dead, and that will be our chance to stabilize the front around Moscow." This was delivered with the understanding of someone who clearly had not heard a word or did not want to hear of what Guderian had passed along. So, throwing caution to the wind, von Bock retorted with, "By then, the army group will be kaput, or finished." Halder, now emotional, i.e. angry, replied, "The German soldier does not go kaput." Von Bock, for his part, not getting anywhere, at least anywhere constructive, got off the line. Knowing the high command, but also knowing the situation of Army Group Center and what it was facing, he told his staff to begin planning a withdrawal. His front, Army Group Center's front, more than 300 miles or 482 kilometers long, was about to retreat by at least 100 kilometers or 62 miles, maybe even more. Moscow had just been saved. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So I just want to take a second and say hi and thank you, of course, to some new members and those who have donated. Let's see here. New members. Dennis Boyles from Australia. Thank you very much, Dennis. Adam Shope. Sorry, Adam, also from Australia. Australia is clearly here to represent. And then there's the one and only Gregory Houghton. I hope I'm getting that right, Greg, Big G. He became a member and donated, so Gregory, is my new best friend. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this series. We're seeing how Zhukov is trying to, on one hand, control Stalin, control his expectations, his instinct to counterpunch. That had already lost them over 1 million men, so clearly that wasn't the way to go yet. And also to slowly pry the Germans away who, again, low on supplies, not dealing with the cold very effectively, smaller air force than the Russians. And so he's doing a brilliant job of that. So we'll just see how this continues, how the Russians try to build on it, and yet at the same time, of course, the Germans' plan is to just hold on until winter is over and relaunch their offensive in the spring. We'll just have to see how it goes. So again, thank you everybody who listens, and I will see you in a couple days with the next episode. Take care, everyone.